and we are now live on all 8 of our streaming sites. So welcome to Letter to Philippi Live. My name is Sean Emsley. I am the founder of lettertophilippi.org, a new Messianic Jewish theological and teaching organization. And I'll be your teacher here as we continue our study through Paul's letter to Philippi, also known more commonly as Philippians. So today, as we continue through chapter 3, we'll be looking at verses 4 through 6, Paul's Jewish resume. As we've seen in the earlier verses of this chapter, specifically in chapter 2 and chapter 3, Paul was dealing with false teachers that were coming to Philippi. They were either there or it was a threat to the faith of the believers in Philippi that Paul was pre-warning them about. So here in this chapter here, Paul is laying out that there are false teachers coming. As we said, we don't know the exact identity of these people, meaning that Paul just used epithets, which he calls them dogs, evil workers, and the mutilated. And as I said, many commentators understand these epithets to be referring to these opponents that Paul is warning about, were either Jews or they were somehow either non-Jews who were converts to Judaism, who were calling the Philippian believers to also, like them, be circumcised and to fully take on becoming Jewish, along with, and actually to supplement their faith trust in Yeshua as the Messiah. So, and Paul is strongly opposed to this, being that it's clearly taught by the apostles, and we see in the Jerusalem Council, that Jews should come to Messiah as Jews. Gentiles should come to Messiah as Gentiles and as followers of the one God of Israel, as redeemed Gentiles, without the need to convert to Judaism before becoming followers of Yeshua. So we see that these false teachers are coming, and Paul's now confronting them. As we said, one of the main themes that runs throughout the whole book of Philippians is humility, and the self-sacrificing nature of Yeshua, our righteous Messiah. So in chapter 2, we see the highest level of humility and self-sacrifice, that of Yeshua, our righteous Messiah. And then later in chapter 2, Paul gives the examples of Timothy and Epaphroditus, two flesh and blood people that the people in Philippi were familiar with, who were also demonstrating Messiah-like humility, Messiah-like self-sacrifice. And in this chapter, we see what Dr. Stern in his commentary called a negative example of humility, that being pride. So in this here, we continue with the theme of humility throughout the book, but here Paul's giving a negative example of pride from these false teachers who are coming and calling the people in Philippi to have a understanding of their faith in Yeshua that was incorrect, that somehow they were inadequate in their faith in Yeshua as Gentiles who put their faith trust in Yeshua. But Paul here is saying these teachers are wrong, they're full of pride, and we are to stand against pride. Paul here is now laying before them his example and showing that the most important thing to have pride in is knowing Messiah of Israel. So verses 4 through 6, we'll read them, and then we will go into a little commentary on them. Even though I certainly have grounds for putting confidence in such things, if anyone else thinks he has grounds for putting confidence in human qualifications, I have better grounds. Brit Milah on the 8th day, by birth belonging to the people of Israel, from the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew speaker with Hebrew-speaking parents, in regard to the Torah, a paroush. In regard to zeal, a persecutor of the Messianic community. In regard to the righteousness demanded by legalism, blameless. So Paul lays forward here what we see as his Jewish resume. And interesting enough that he says that even though I still have grounds for putting confidence in things, if anyone else thinks he has grounds for putting confidence in human qualifications, I have better grounds. So we can see here that Paul is confronting the false teachers coming to Philippi by saying if they're going to be proud in whatever accomplishments or physical or human qualifications that they have, that I have far more, and I could boast about them. But we'll see here that his only boast is in the Messiah, Yeshua. But he lays forward that these people are going to be caught up in pride over whatever qualifications that they have in the human qualifications, that he is far above them in any kind of qualifications. As I said, being Brit Milah on the 8th day, by birth to the people of Israel, from the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew speaker with Hebrew-speaking parents, in regard to the Torah, Parush, in regard to zeal persecuting the Messianic community, in regard to righteousness demanded by legalism, blameless. Many commentators see these verses as a way for Paul to out-credential the opponents who are advocating for Gentile circumcision and Torah observance for Gentiles by putting forward his spectacular Jewish resume. So that's one way to look at that. Look at this, at these verses here, that Paul is saying, okay, you false teachers, if you want to boast about your qualifications, you want to boast about your background, you want to boast about your physical qualifications, your knowledge, your practice of Judaism, whatever it may be, whatever they had pride in. He said, I have much more to be proud about. So one way of looking at this is that he was saying to the people of Philippi, these people have these things about them. If they want to be proud in that, I'm far above them in any qualifications that they may have. As I said, if these people were Gentile converts of Judaism who were telling that the people in Philippi needed to be circumcised to be fully a part of the people of Israel, Paul not only was circumcised, but he was circumcised on the 8th day and was brought up in a Hebrew-speaking house it was a born Jew who was born into an observant Jewish home. So that is one way to look at that. Paul here is telling the Philippians that these people are going to be proud about whatever qualifications, whatever they see as important. I have much more to be proud about if I were to be proud of my own accomplishments. Rather than seeing out credentials opponents, Paul is also placing before the people of Philippi, his authority as teacher of them as Philippian Gentiles. Paul's instructing them about their new life within Jewish life as Gentiles and his authority over those opponents who are trying to bring the Philippian Yeshua followers into conformity with their former pagan life and the norms of society. So Paul here is another way of looking at that is that he's setting forward his authority as the one to be the teacher of the people in Philippi. And he's setting forward his Jewish resume to say, I'm the one who brought you the message of the Messiah. I'm the one who has this background as a faithful Jew, and I'm bringing you the message of the Jewish Messiah, the message of the God of Israel, the message of the scriptures of Israel. And I am one born to the people of Israel from the tribe of Benjamin, raised in a Hebrew-speaking home, raised in a home where the practice of Judaism was there. So if anyone were to come to them, Paul was saying, I am the one who is your teacher. I am the one who brought you the message of the Messiah. And I am the one who has authority to tell you how you are to live in your life as followers of the God of Israel, because I am the one who is the apostle of the Gentiles. I'm the one who brought you the message of the Messiah. I'm the one that is your teacher. I'm the one that you should listen to. And these other false teachers coming to you, they don't have that authority because I was the one, but God granted the authority to be the apostle to the Gentiles. Paul's instructing them about their new life within their life as following the God of Israel and the Messiah of Israel. And his authority of those, and his authority over all who would come as teachers before them, that any teaching brought to the people of Philippi should be held up to, is that what Paul taught us? Is that what we received from Paul, who is the one who is the authoritative teacher, that is the apostle of the Gentiles? He is the one who truly speaks for the Messiah, and he is the one that we should listen to. Paul clarifies that not only is he a Jew, but he's a Jew par excellence. We see that he comes from observant parents who had him circumcised on the 8th day to observe the Torah command. According to Theodoret, a early Christian theologian cited in the ancient Christian commentary on Scripture, Paul bolstered his authority by specifying his descent from Benjamin, the son of Rachel, Jacob's beloved wife. So Paul here is calling the people of Philippi to understand that he is the one who has brought him the true message of the Messiah. He is the one who is the one that they should follow when it comes to how to live their lives. And he bolsters, as we see with Theodoret, one of the early Christian theologians, lay forward that Paul here, in referencing his descent from Benjamin, the child of the beloved wife Rachel of Jacob, the ancestor, Jacob the patriarch, by holding up that he was a descendant of Jacob, descendant through Jacob, and descendant from Rachel, the beloved wife. He's holding out that he has the authority over them as one who can claim descendant from Jacob and Rachel, from the patriarchs and the matriarchs, that he is the one who is to be the one to instruct them in their new life, following the God of Israel, following the Messiah of Israel, and living within their new life as followers of Israel's God, even though they continue to live in a pagan Gentile world. In these verses, Paul speaks of his connection to and zealous practice of Judaism. Paul here was a student of the great Jewish sage Gamaliel, which we learn in Acts 22, verse 3. And Paul sought to advance his learning to exceed his peers, which we see in Galatians 1:14, where he talks about that he exceeded all in the study and practice of Judaism, that he was the top learner of his school. He was the great learner, the great one who was taking in all that he could about. He was on his way to be one of the great sages of Judaism, like his teachers, Gamaliel. And he sought to advance his learning to prove himself as faithful and zealous for the Torah. That his focus was to learn more and to grow more in his learning and his practice, to exceed all others in the knowledge and the practice of Judaism. Paul here showed in this laying forward of his resume no dissatisfaction concerning his life as a Jew, as one who had practiced Judaism with zeal, even as far as claiming to be blameless about Torah. So Paul here is saying that his place as a status is the one. If you want to learn how to live your life following the God of Israel, if you want to learn your life following in the path of the Jewish Messiah, I'm the one who has devoted my whole life to the study of the Torah, the practice of Judaism, the practice of Jewish life, and the one who is the teacher that you should be listening to. All other teachers, their message has to be held up against what I've given to you. I'm the one who has the authority. I'm the one who has devoted my whole life to Judaism and Jewish practice and to the Jewish scriptures. And I'm the one to tell you how to live your life following the Messiah of Israel. According to Dr. David Friedman of most blessed memory, Paul speaks in the present tense of his life as a Parush, as a Pharisee. When presenting his Jewish resume, Paul here, in giving his Jewish resume, this is now later in his life, this is maybe 20, 25 years after he came to know Yeshua the Messiah. And he referred to his expression of Jewish life, the expression of Judaism as a Pharisee, saying that even now he understood himself, being as they would say in the Christian rule, that he had been a Christian for 20 years. But in that time, being the follower of the Yeshua the Messiah, he still understood himself and his relation to Torah, his relation to Jewish life and Judaism, as a Pharisee, as a Parush, as a faithful Jew, and as one who was living his life as an observant Jew and a follower of Yeshua, our righteous Messiah, and that he did not cease being a Pharisee when he came to know Yeshua, which scholars like the Christian scholar N.T. Wright understands that Paul ceased being a Pharisee when he put his faith trust in Yeshua, that he was leaving behind his Pharisaical life to be a follower of Yeshua. But Paul makes clear that he still understood his life within the context of Judaism and with his life as an observant Jew, as a Parush, as a Pharisee. Even now, at the end of his life, 20, 25 years after he came to contact Yeshua on the road to Damascus, he considered himself a Jew following the Messiah of Israel. Paul's zealousness for the Torah motivated him to succeed in his traditional Jewish studies, as he sought the highest level of Torah observance taught by his teachers. As we said, Paul didn't want to just be an average student, an average observer of Torah, an average scholar and sage of Judaism. He sought to be the highest level. He wanted to be a sage like his master Gamliel, as he was brought up within Judaism, within Jewish life. His focus and practice was to become more and more into understanding of the Torah, into living the Torah and being zealous for all the commands of the Torah. Paul underscored this, as I said earlier, in Acts 1:14, that his zealousness included his zeal for the oral Torah, the traditions passed down by his ancestors. So not only was Paul zealous for the written Torah, he was zealous for the oral Torah and the traditions of the elders, the traditions that have been developed throughout Jewish life. And Paul here, his zeal included the full body of Jewish knowledge, of Jewish understanding, Jewish practice. And he continued to live this life as an observant Jew, as a zealous Jew, as a follower of Messiah, to being a true Messianic Jew, that he was committed to Judaism, he was committed to Jewish life, and he was committed to Yeshua, our righteous Messiah. Unfortunately, he admits that his zealousness for his religious practice led him to persecute the followers of Yeshua and seek to destroy the early Messianic Jewish community. And he clearly admits here that his zeal for Judaism, his zeal for the Torah, his zeal for the defense of the God of Israel led him to persecuting the early Messianic community and going to the point of having early followers of Yeshua put to death. And that was the height of his zeal. And though that is not something that he would continue to be proud of what happened to those who lost their lives and were persecuted and killed for their faith in the Messiah. But he shows that his zeal was so great for Jewish life, for Torah, and for defending the name of the God of Israel, he was willing to go this far. And we know that he had a complete turnaround in his perspective about the Messiah and came to change his ways. But he still held to that he had that level of zeal for Judaism, that he was willing to go after even the early Messianic community. In the detailed listing of his Jewish credentials, Paul expresses confidence in them in verse 4. He also says that he holds confidence in these things, and he says in contrast, we'll see, to those who were the false teachers coming to Philippi, who had confidence, had boasting in whatever their false teaching was, whatever their practice or attitude or whatever it was that brought them pride. They continue to hold on to their pride and their boasting, but we'll see this as we continue studying here, that Rav Shaul Paul will talk that he will put aside all of his confidence, all of his boasting about all of the greatness that was in his life, focusing solely on knowing Yeshua, knowing the Messiah. We see Paul's abiding connection as a Jew to his Jewish people when he warmly describes them in Romans 9:4-5, as we read before in chapter 2. But these verses are worthy of repeating here. The people of Israel, they were made God's children. The Shekhinah has been with them. The covenants are theirs. Likewise, the giving of the Torah, the temple service, and the promises. The patriarchs are there. And from them, as far as physical descent is concerned, came the Messiah, who is over all. Praise be Adonai forever. Amen. In saying that he is a Hebrew speaker with Hebrew-speaking parents, Paul and a community, and therefore had a higher status from diaspora Jews. Paul stresses about his opponents to focus on human qualifications, that he had better qualifications than they did, which could indicate his opponents were converts to Judaism. Paul points out his lifelong Jewish status, as well as the status as a Hebrew-speaking Jew. So if these opponents were converts to Judaism and were calling the Gentiles in Philippi to also like them to become circumcised after putting their faith trust in Yeshua, Paul here is saying, I'm not someone who's a convert Jew. I am a Jew born into a Jewish family. This was born into a Hebrew-speaking family, born into the context of the Jewish people, descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I'm the one to be the one to instruct this community about faith and practice. And that if these opponents were proud of the fact that they had converted to Judaism, Paul is saying that is one thing. But if we're going to compare ourselves, we were going to have a boasting contest that he wasn't going to get into. But he said, if I was to boast, I can far outboast any of you in any of your qualifications. But as we will see later in our study, that he is willing to lay all of this aside, all of this for the knowledge of Yeshua, the Messiah. Paul's listing was Jewish credentials and heritage in Philippians 3, 4 through 6, added Romans 9, 4 through 5, brings to mind the Passover song Dayenu. Passover is one of my favorite Jewish holidays. So when I read through these verses, it really brought to mind the Dayenu, that Paul putting forward all of these things about his life, all the great things that God has done in his life. And we'll see that he will say that of all of these great things that God has done in my life, the most important thing that exceeds all of them is the knowledge of Yeshua, the Messiah. In the song sung during the Passover Seder, Dayenu, we see a progression of 15 miracles performed by God for the Jewish people. And I'll read through the 15 miracles here. Number 1, if he had brought us out of Egypt. Number 2, if he had executed justice upon the Egyptians. 3, if he had executed justice upon their gods. 4, if he had slain their firstborn. 5, if he had given us their health and wealth. 6, if he had split the sea for us. 7, if he had let us through on dry land. 8, if he had drowned our oppressors. 9, if he had provided for our needs in the wilderness for 40 years. 10, if he had fed us manna. 11, if he had given us Shabbat. Number 12, if he led us to Mount Sinai. 13, if he had given us the Torah. 14, if he had brought us into the land of Israel. And 15, if he built the temple for us, Dayenu. Following the recitation of each of these miraculous events is the chorus of Dayenu, a Hebrew word meaning that would have been enough. The recitation of each of these miracles, from being brought out of Egypt to the building of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, would in its own right be a sufficient blessing that would have been enough from the God of Israel to the people of Israel. Paul is likewise listing his Jewish credentials, minus his persecution of believers, as blessings from God, each of which is of great value, a Dayenu, such as each of the miracles of the song, which can stand alone as a miraculous event, being even more of a blessing. As we'll see in verse 8, Paul's greatest Dayenu, blessing in this life, is knowing Messiah Yeshua and following Yeshua, his righteous Messiah. Everything else about his life and heritage is valuable and is a Dayenu, is something to be rejoicing about and saying it would have been enough if he had just been born a Jew and circumcised on the 8th day. That would have been enough. If he would have been born into a Hebrew-speaking home, Dayenu, that would have been enough. If he had been born from the tribe of Benjamin, that would have been enough, Dayenu. If he would have been born into a Hebrew-speaking home, Dayenu. If he had just lived his life as a Parush and followed the God of Israel in that way, Dayenu. If he had been just zealous for the God of Israel, that would have been enough, Dayenu. And finally, being blameless according to the Torah, blameless according to Torah observance. That would have been a Dayenu, a great blessing from God. All of these things he lays forward in his Jewish resume were great blessings and would be worthy of a Dayenu, of a praise to God, saying that would have been enough. Each of these things would have been more than enough, but each one keeps coming on, new miracles, new blessings from God given to him. But as we'll see tomorrow, as we get into verse 8, Paul's greatest Dayenu, his greatest blessing, his greatest that would have been enough, and more than enough, is knowing the Messiah Yeshua. And that should be the same thing for us. The greatest accomplishment, the greatest thing that we can say about ourselves is that we have come to know Yeshua the Messiah. The knowledge of Yeshua the Messiah is the greatest thing of all. Any human accomplishments, any greatness of your lineage or background, the greatness of your works, whether you are an artist, the greatest art pieces you make, or you're an athlete, the greatest, awards and winning championships, whatever it is, the greatest thing of value that anyone can have is to know Messiah Yeshua and to know him and the knowledge of him and the union with him by faith trust is beyond anything, beyond any value. There's nothing more valuable than knowing the Messiah and knowing the new life that only he provides. And Paul will make that clear, that everything about his life, everything that he could be proud of, everything that he's thankful for God that was given to him in his life, in being born from the tribe of Benjamin, born into an observant home, raised in the faith of Judaism at the very feet of Gamaliel, one of the great sages of Judaism, and leading his life into Pharisaism as a rising Pharisee, and even after even more than that, moving into his life as the apostle of Gentiles, as the one called by the Messiah himself to go into all the world and to bring the message of the Messiah. Everything of value in his life, we'll see, will be considered worthless to just the knowing of Messiah. Knowing Yeshua is the most important thing. As I said, Paul's greatest anu, the greatest blessing in his life, is knowing the Messiah and following Yeshua. Everything else about his life and heritage is valuable and a divine blessing, but they do not compare with the revelation of Yeshua in his life. After an extensive listing of all he can boast about from his Jewish resume, and all he has had from birth and practice, Paul made clear to the Philippians that his only source of true confidence was in Yeshua, living in union with the Messiah as his sole focus. And we'll see that tomorrow as we move into the next section here in the book of Philippians 3. The cost of knowing Messiah. That Paul will look over his whole life, look all over these blessings, all these dainos in his life, and say the greatest thing of all in his life is knowing Messiah. And his encounter with Messiah on the road to Emmaus was transformative. And his knowledge of Yeshua, his encounter with the Messiah, makes everything else in his life. He's going to call it worthless, even beyond worthless. The knowledge of Yeshua, the knowledge of Messiah, to Paul was everything. And to us, it should be our everything too. To understand that each day we should become more and more and more in the Messiah and our knowledge of him. And we need to seek out to become more like the Messiah. And for those who are yet to acknowledge Yeshua as the Messiah, I call you to like Paul, to look at Yeshua, to be willing to see in Yeshua, the Jewish Messiah, who brings atonement, who brings new life, who brings life now and life forever with the God of Israel. Yeshua is the Jewish Messiah. There is no other. If you are waiting for the Jewish Messiah, to come. He has already come, and he will return. And Paul calls us to, each one of us, to come to know the Messiah, to come to walk in his ways, and to see Yeshua as the one who is our source of life now and forever, and to live our lives as Jews and as non-Jews who follow the God of Israel and walk in the ways of the Jewish Messiah, that we may walk on different paths as Jews or Gentiles. The calling there is first and foremost to acknowledge Yeshua as the Messiah, to acknowledge him as Lord, to acknowledge him as your King, and the one that you have devoted all of your life to. So this is what Paul has set forward today. What I said is a spectacular Jewish resume. And we'll see that he said that all these things are great. All these things are blessings from God. Dainu, as I said, in reference to the Passover song, which we can see a connection to here in Philippians 3, and Paul's laying forward of all the blessings in his life, of his heritage and learning in Judaism. And we'll see tomorrow as we move into Paul speaking about the cost of knowing Messiah, that his willingness to lay everything aside, consider everything, all the blessings of his life as less than nothing for the sole knowledge of Yeshua. And we too must understand that the highest thing of value in our lives, the highest thing that we hold on to, is our knowledge of the Messiah, and knowing Messiah and becoming more and more and more in the Messiah every day is the goal of our lives, is what we should be focused on, and should seek to model our Messiah every day. So that will conclude our time today. We looked at Paul's Jewish resume from Philippians 3, 4 through 6. And as I said, tomorrow we'll be looking at Philippians 3, 7 through 11, the cost of knowing Messiah, where Paul will set forward that the most important thing in his life, and he calls the Philippians and us to understand, is the knowledge of Yeshua, knowing the Messiah of Israel, knowing him better and better each day, and to growing more and more like our Master is to be our focus. And that's what we'll be seeing in our next time together, looking at Paul's letter to Philippi. And this is the Letter to Philippi live broadcast. My name is Sean Imsley. I will be your teacher. And you can find out more about Letter to Philippi at lettertophilippi.org, lettertophilippi.org. And you can find out about our work of Letter to Philippi. You can leave a prayer request. As I said, we'll be praying for you, praying for your requests. You can purchase a copy of my commentary on Philippians, which is the basis for this class, on our resources page. You can make a contribution and continue the work of Letter to Philippi on our giving page. You can watch past classes on our teaching page. And if you have any questions, you can use our contact form and send them in. We want to be bringing these messages to you, bringing these studies on Paul's letter to Philippi, that all of us can come to become more and more like the Messiah each day. So thank you for watching. And again, Letter to Philippi Live comes to you Monday through Friday, 12 p.m. Pacific time, 3 p.m. Eastern time, 10 p.m. Jerusalem time. And tomorrow we'll be looking at the cost of knowing Messiah from Philippians 3, 7 through 11. Shalom for now, and have a good day. And may you become more and more and more in the Messiah every day. Shalom.